Okay, welcome then to our last gender sound sessions today with the presentation of Dr. Lucy O'Brien, Identity, the Ley Lines of Punk Feminism. Good afternoon, Dr. O'Brien. Hello.
Good afternoon. Hello. I'm sitting in my room in University of West London. Just finished teaching a class. So really nice to meet you all.
Thank you so much. As you might all know, in the gender sound sessions, we have conducted 5 different approaches to feminist musicology in genres like rock with Dr. Gina Arnold, jazz with Dr. Sherry Tucker. We learned about opera with Dr. Christy Brown Montesano and discussed about the efficacy of Black feminine genius with Dr. Fredera Hadley. All this has been possible with the support of the Escola Superior de Música de Catalunya, ESMUC. Thank you all, truly. Today, Dr. Lucy O'Brien, we are going to learn about how punk feminism was forged in the 1970s through music and visual communication, and how that has resonated through the 90s Riot Girl and the millennial Me Too movement. Dr. O'Brien is a writer. Brian is a writer and broadcaster for numerous titles, including Mojo, the Sunday Times, and the Guardian. As an academic, she teaches, as she said, at the University of West London, music industry and management and artist development. And this 2020, she has co-authored the Amazon bestseller, It Takes Blood and Guts with the Skin, with the lead singer of Skunk Anansi, and published the special 25th anniversary edition of her book, She Bop, The Definitive History of Women in Popular Music. Dr. O'Brien is also author of Dusty, the classic biography, and Madonna, Like an Icon, which has been translated into 13 languages. Currently, she's working on a major biography of Karen Carpenter, which is due out next year. And on today's presentation, she will analyze how the visibility of the early pioneers helps to nourish and build a feminist music culture and a new music industry, presenting examples of new iterations of punk feminism with this generation of female-driven bands and artists like Meet Me at the Altar, Big Johnny, Skating Polly, and 2 bands from Spain, Lisa and Simpson and the Melenas, right? So as a reminder, we want to let you know that afterwards we have questions and answers and translation if needed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen, and I've also got a paper that I will read from, so bear with me. And very happy to have a chat at the end. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. And I will get my PowerPoint up. Okay. So identity, the ley lines of punk feminism, I apologies, I was going to give this paper on the 28th of March, but unfortunately I went down with Omicron, which is not very nice. But I'm here now and I'm all recovered and very happy to be here today. Okay, so now there's a picture of me with my synthesizer in 1980. And that's my fellow band members, all-girl band. We were called the Catholic Girls, and that's just before a gig we were going to play. So that's by way of introduction. It's great to be revisiting the questions of punk feminism. As a former punk who played in an all-girl band in 1979 and brought feminist ideas into the music press in the 80s and 90s, I see my work in this area as a form of grounded theory. As defined by Corbin and Strauss, grounded theory is a research method where you gather data and you build a theoretical framework over time. In a way, grounded theory can be a form of life work. And I see this thread not just in my own evolution of punk feminism, but in the wider context of movements of punk, subculture, and feminism. Another picture there of my friends, and this was the year of the wedding of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, believe it or not, hence all the bunting in the streets. So this seminar is grounded in The Woman Punk Made Me, a polemical essay that I wrote in 1999 for the essay collection Punk Rock, So What? And now, 23 years later, I'm struck by how punk continues to define us. For women who came of age on the 1970s punk scene, it has become both an internalized thought process and a source of strength and agency in the world around us. To explore this further, I'll read from a stream of consciousness reflection on what punk meant to me as a teenager. I first read this at the Kismet conference at the University of Porto in 2018, and it's also part of a chapter for Gina Arnold and George Mackay's Oxford Handbook of Punk Rock. When we made music, we consciously tried to make sounds that we hadn't heard before. It had to be new. When we dressed, we tried to wear clothes that hadn't been worn that way before, or to cut our hair in a way that we hadn't seen before. We tried to dance in a way we had not seen before. Conscious is the key word. Viv Albertine from the Slits says, we were very conscious and alert. Punk is a state of mind and decision-making. It doesn't matter and it doesn't change if you grow older or you grow your hair or if you have children or if you move to the country. DIY, do it yourself. Those words resonate. It's not a punk cliche, it's a way of life. In the absence of a role model or a path or a channel, you make it yourself. If it hasn't been done before in the way you imagine, you do it yourself. Making is the key word. Punk was always about construction. It was very physical. I want to make something happen, so I get the tools to do it. I get the guitar, we buy the drums on hire purchase, we get the Saturday job to get the drums and guitar. We meet every Tuesday and every Thursday after school, and we work at creating new sounds on our instruments and record them and put them together into tracks and songs. And then we stop and listen back to what we've done. And then we listen to Pill or the Slits or Susie and the Banshees, and we deconstruct them, take them apart and listen. Punk was about construction and deconstruction. It was like brutalist architecture. The mechanics are on the outside. Punk had a work ethic. In his book, Global Punk, Dunn argues, if you're trying to rebel, you don't volunteer to check out, you step to it. We worked hard, we grafted, we had the tools of an analog culture. We used printed words and makeup and hair dye and guitars and cut-ups and photocopiers and drums and textiles and paint and montage. Everything we had, we made a decision about. Everything was a tool for expression. This is another picture of our band on stage in 1979, and that's me on the right. Female participation in subculture is an under-researched area, yet women shape the future of music scenes in many creative ways. The participation of older women in punk subculture is documented even less. I'm grateful to Andy Bennett for his work on fan practices of punk, people beyond the age of 30. He did a study called Punk's Not Dead, and in his research, he suggested that self-identified older male punk fans, older punk fans tended to be male, and that female punk fans have moved on from the 1970s scene that spawned them. I wasn't so sure about this, so to find out whether female punks had indeed disappeared, in 2017, I put up a Facebook post asking any 1970s female punks to get in touch with me. The response was immediate. Within a day, my post had 80 likes. there's the post. I sent out a structured questionnaire and I did some semi-structured interviews asking women from the original punk generation how they articulate and manage punk in their lives now. Though supportive of the project, many respondents to my Facebook post had busy work and family lives, so not all had the time to do interviews. Those that did were honest and open in their answers. It can be argued that they were a self-selecting group rather than representative of 70s punk women as a whole. However, even women who don't consider themselves to be living punk now, when questioned further, they realised that the values of community and authenticity were still really important to them. The results collated during 2018 to 19 from a diverse group of 18 women in their 50s showed that far from moving on, older women's punk identity has grown with them, and it affects their decision-making in every area of life, from clothes to music to work and to politics. Subculture offers a way to maintain dissidence, and older punk women are practiced at negotiating the creative fault lines of their subcultural and more normative identities. The subcultural experience of their youth is woven into their psychology and decision-making in family and workplace environments, often to profound effect. In this seminar, I will look first at the social factors influencing the female punk generation in the 70s, before discussing how those women live punk now and how it has filtered through different generations. Mannheim's sociology of generations is a useful way to frame 1970s female punk. Generation can be defined as a way of understanding differences between age groups and as a means of locating people within historical time. If the study of generations marks social change and continuity, what's pronounced in the 1970s punk story is the relationship between personal and social change. According to Mannheim, formative experiences during youth are the key period in which social generations are formed. A cohort is defined as people who experience the same significant event within a given period of time. Male and female punk peers experienced the 1970s era as a cohort, and those still living it now see themselves as defined by the punk cultural battlefield. The sociologist Jane Pilcher, she builds on Mannheim's legacy and explores how young people are integrated into society via socialization. She looks at different generations and argues that generations can be drivers of social change, but not every generation develops a distinctive consciousness. Active generation units become agencies of change in times of accelerated social shifts when normality is disrupted. For many of my female interviewees, there was the sense of inventing material, groping for words to express their experience. They were at the forefront, felt that they were at the forefront of some kind of social change. And they also felt that there was the formulation of an emotional language that didn't yet exist. Linda Sterling, the artist who did the images for the Buzzcocks Orgasm Addict record sleeve, said to me, "We were trying to find a new vocabulary." But 4 decades later, punk women are still redefining that vocabulary. This is a poster from a Women's Day march in the 1970s. And a lot of what drove the politics of our punk was a lot of the women's activism, women's liberation activism of the time. So in order to explore 70s female punk, it's useful to identify the social triggers of that new female consciousness. In the UK, the Equal Pay Act of 1970 and the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 opened up new career opportunities for women. Widespread use of the pill meant greater sexual freedom, while second wave feminism and free higher education broadened our choices. we were aware of how our mothers' lives had been restricted and how many of them responded to that restriction with depression or anger or prescription medication like Valium. There were leftist political movements along with feminism that helped to forge punk, and that link between individual consciousness and wider social structures. The late 70s and early 80s was a very politicized environment. There were lots of riots, there was recession, there was unemployment. There was a lot of activist work from Marxist and socialist political groups. It was a real combustible mix. Mannheim argues that in a period of significant cultural change, the youngest social generation that grows to adulthood fully embodies that change. And 1970s punk, to an extent, was that formative. It was creating a foundational generation. Mannheim argues that members of a foundational generation have a concrete bond through their exposure to and their participation in the social process of destabilization, such as in time of war. It's significant that punks saw everyday culture as a kind of battleground. And to be a punk in the 1970s meant being routinely subject to violence, getting beaten up on the street or attacked at gigs. And this was something that happened to us in our all-girl band, you know, with skinheads. It meant being subject to violence, and demonstrations and being attacked at gigs was commonplace. As Joe Strummer from The Clash once famously said, always wear good shoes that are good for running or fighting. That maxim applied to women as well as men. All punks were seen as a provocation to mainstream society at that time. So here I've got a slide which is kind of echoing Mannheim's sociology of generations, and the researcher, historical researcher Susan O'Brien has built on this in her book, talking about the Daughters of Charity. And she talks about the life cycle or biography of a community. And the same principles of generational units can be applied when we think about a biography of punk feminism, and we're kind of tracing those ley lines of punk feminism and how they've come through generations. And I see this as going through 5 distinct phases. So you have the first foundation generation, and then you have the expansion generation, the conserving one, the renewal one, and the transformation. So if we think about the foundation punk generation in the 1970s, 80s, this laid the groundwork for a DIY feminism, particularly in the fields of music and fashion and visual art. Then if we think about the expansion period in the 1990s, this coincided with third wave feminism, and this found a real focus in the fanzine-led network of Riot Girl. Then comes the conserving period. And the 2000s generation, this was a more stable and also at the same time potentially reactionary phase, because here there was a lot of discussion of post-feminism, the idea of post-feminism and a kind of neoliberal consumer feminism. It could be argued that the Spice Girls and their girl power concept were a form of that consumer feminism. Then you come to the 4th generation, and it's the 2010s. And what was significant about that point was there was a return to foundational principles and that early feminist activism. Particularly, we saw in the band Pussy Riot, who were arrested by the Russian authorities, and their intervention was a stark reminder that in many countries the idea of post-feminism was purely academic. Then you have, then you have the transformation generation, which is the most recent iteration, which has kind of been with us from 2017 onwards. and has sort of built on that DIY activist principle. And we've seen it particularly within social media campaigns like the hashtag #MeToo campaign and Time's Up campaign. And this was fueled by real enthusiasm for that second and third wave feminist history, and came through in lots of new girl punk bands like Trash Kit and Skinny Girl Diet. There's some artwork by Linda Sterling, the visual artist who did some of the real iconic feminist punk images from the 70s. So in considering the foundational generation of female punk, it's useful to consider Hogg, Terry and White's concept of identity salience. They argue that an individual's identity framework is used in diverse situations. My female respondents maintain that they use their punk identity in many different circumstances, and they use it as a source of strength. They also use it as a tool and a way to negotiate difficult life transitions. And that might be anything from their jobs or relationships to bringing up children. It's a form of self-identity, and particularly for participants who identify strongly with a group or a cohort. For my research, my punk respondents' thoughts tended to cohere around 4 main themes or categories. Firstly, hair, secondly, clothes, thirdly, fear, and fourthly, power. And I'll go into those in a bit more detail. There you can see Linda Sterling's fantastic Buzzcocks album sleeve. And she used a lot of cut-up montage techniques in her work. So hair. It was an important part of the female punk project to construct a new visual vocabulary, jamming the male gaze with spikes, peroxide, and extreme makeup. In disrupting what's considered normative or natural, we were making explicit how the body is socially marked and culturally constructed as a woman. Our parent generation saw dyed hair as very cheap and brassy and non-intellectual, so we used harsh peroxide dye in a way that felt vivid and dramatic and beautiful. My respondents have distinct and powerful memories of their hair. This is Karen Amsden, who remembers a Mohican of varying colours and a whole can of Boots extra hold hairspray. And she used to layer it on to keep it rigid. And the colours she dyed it ranged from pink to red to blue to green. Another one of my respondents, Liz Naylor, viewed her haircut as a combination of liberation and self-harm. She said, prior to punk, my hair was shoulder length and frizzy. Then I saw the Sex Pistols on UK TV and literally cut my hair off in front of the mirror. I had patches where I went down to the scalp. It was quite violent. Secondly, we think about clothes. High street clothing available to 1970s women in the UK came with a very restricted palette, and it tended to be flared jeans and glittery tops, or very, very floaty Laura Ashley dresses. Mass market girls' magazines like Jackie had very regimented hair and beauty advice. Polly Hancock, one of the founders of the blog punkgirldiaries.com, said, I read Jackie like it was a manual, a horror show with no enthusiasm. It was like someone had cut out a template that I had to fit into, or I'd be an outcast. All of my respondents recall turning to jumble sales and vintage shops for their clothing. The music writer Vivian Goldman said to me, the punk era was a peak moment, a gilded age for finding things in jumble sales. We were getting the post-war stuff from the 1940s, even the 1930s. I remember getting one black velvet tea dress from Portobello Road that was even from the 1920s. For Goldman, clothes symbolised creative freedom. So punk women were recycling not just the clothes of the parent generation, but also their grandparents. and they were wearing quote unquote old lady dresses with Dr. Martin boots, or suede kitten heel stilettos with drainpipe jeans. Liz Naylor recalls, I was a lesbian and punk gave me permission. I wore a mixture of 1950s and 60s men's clothes, beautiful collared shirts and winkle pickers. We were cross-dressing not just in gender, but also decades. In reworking clothes of previous generations, punk women were reconstructing the experience of their parents and their grandparents. They were also making a satirical comment on the gender coding that restricted the choices of their mothers and their grandmothers. A mixed race respondent saw freedom in reimagining her mother's clothes. She says, being mixed race, I loved polystyrene and X-ray specs. I had a skinhead style with a copper fringe. I discovered my mum had loads of pencil skirts with bolero jackets that she made in the 1960s. And I wore those with stiletto winkle pickers and heavy black eyeliner and trotted down the road in Bromley to meet friends and sing in an all-girl punk band. Dressing as a punk in the 1970s was highly risky. Alison Goldie recalls having blue hair and wearing a leopard short coat and hefty men's work boots. A man punched me in the face in the street. I think I was a terrible visual affront to him. Women instinctively know that codes around beauty are one of the biggest issues about being a woman. Punk was a culture jam that deconstructed that culture of looking. As a result, violence or the threat of violence was constant. Many respondents talked about being attacked in the streets or at gigs, but feel that these experiences gave them strategies to deal with fear. So fear is my third category. Women are trained from girlhood to avoid confrontation. As John Berger writes, women act, women appear. According to Slits guitarist Viv Albertine, turning the male gaze back on the viewer freaked men out. Dealing with fear was a key part of being a punk. This is Helen Reddington here on the right as a solo artist, and on the left you can see her in her first band in Brighton. Helen Reddington said to me that she felt fear because of things that happened when I was a child. But what punk did was to teach me that if you accept fear as being part of life, you can take it on and beat it. Karen Amsden agrees, saying that punk gave her courage. I would never have performed in a band without punk. Sometimes I felt scared, though, when I was insulted for the way I looked. In their memories of negotiating fear in everyday situations, many respondents demonstrate an understanding of power, particularly gendered power, which brings me to my final category of power. One of my favorite theorists is Foucault when we think about power, and how he talks about how power contains individuals within the rules of an organization. This concept is relevant when we think about women and the organization of gender and power. If a woman disrupts the codes of gendered social relations, she is disciplined, either overtly through aggression from other people or covertly, nuanced suggestion about what she should wear or how she should behave. I mean, major record labels are terrible for this. As Foucault argues, within the distribution of power, there's always resistance or counter-resistance. And this is where punk comes in. Punk women become skilled at negotiating this space of resistance. Judith Roche, who is the bass player in our band, the Catholic Girls, told me how restrictive gender rules at our convent school sparked a spirit of inquiry and rebellion. She said, in our school, we were expected to become a secretary, a nurse, or a wife. It was very hierarchical. The nuns were more interested in defining you than allowing you to define yourself. I thought, I don't want to be defined by that. By forming a feminist punk band that we called the Catholic Girls, we were intrinsically interested in disrupting the system. That act of saying no brought us into conflict with them. We were more threatening than the girls that bunked off or went behind the sheds to have a smoke. We were contesting their power. Which is true, actually. The nuns did get rather tense about us. And she said, I remember teachers trying to imply that I was a bit mad. That's a tool that society uses for women who want to step out of the box. Another of my interviewees used the power of punk to deal with racism. She says, growing up in a very white environment, which was openly National Front, made me feel vulnerable. But punk actually made me feel comfortable within that. And it led me to have a strong, self-motivated self. And it made me question the status quo and become politically active, going on marches, particularly anti-racism and CND. In their study of identity salience, Sklar and DeLong suggest that older participants in a subculture tone down subcultural signifiers in the workplace, and they void out the riskier elements in order to blend in. That implies a separation between selves, that the punk self is more about flamboyant codes for evenings and weekends, and that in later years, subculture just becomes a hobby. For my interviewees, their thinking around dress and identity is just as rigorously defined as it was in their youth. Nuances can be subtle. It might be about the right shade of lipstick or the right boots, and these just act as triggers to punk awareness. They reject notions of age-appropriate dress. So again, we return here to Karen Armstrong in this picture here, and she says, I'm now a working mother in a punk band. 6 years ago, the band I'm in reformed after 25 years, and we now play regularly. This return to music came after some years at home, looking after young children and not earning an income. I feel like a punk rocker again, and it's a mixture of my anger and frustration with the world I'm living in and the desire to show that I will not conform to the idea of what a woman in her 50s looks like. Negotiating and understanding power are key skills that 70s punk women have developed over time. They still have definite views on hair and image, but their resistance is expressed now less in visual terms and more in the strategies they use for agency at home or in the workplace, not just for themselves, but also on behalf of others. Certain key themes emerge from my research. All interviewees, like Polly and Karen, show strong self-motivation. Many are politically active. 70s punk women often work in a way that's collaborative and improvisatory. This is Alison Goldie. Here she is as a punk. And then here she is now in her work as a performance artist. She says, I'm a punk in that I've always been self-employed. I'm anti-authoritarian to the last. I've been a performer, a theatre director, a drama teacher, and a writer. I'm a specialist in improvisation, which is the most punk rock type of performance you can do. 1970s punk women are often active in workplace mediation or leadership roles. This stems from a DIY training, do-it-yourself training in power structures from our teenage years, and a refusal to be intimidated by authority. Here we have Sandra and Donna, who here they are as punks, and here they are at a festival, a recent festival. So Dr. Sandra Baum, on the left, works with people with disabilities and believes strongly in advocacy for those less fortunate than herself. She says, I'm mindful about their position in society and I like to challenge that. And I like to help people to find their own voice. I do this from a senior position in the NHS. I always carry the inner punk with me. And Donna Sussenbach on the right set up an organisation for young people going through the care system into independence. And she says it has worked with thousands of young people going through that difficult transition in their lives. That's my punk mindset. Young adults are creative and resilient, and they're our future. All my interviewees use this DIY approach, especially if they encounter a challenging situation. Going to Liz Naylor, she wrote a punk fanzine in the 1970s, and then in the 1990s, she worked as manager of the Riot Girl band, Huggy Bear. When I spoke to her in 2019, she was running a London charity based in Shoreditch called Foundation for Change, and this one provides education and training for ex-addicts. She said to me, I run it like a DIY indie label. It's the same process. It's extremely radical in terms of public health. We teach people feminism and psychology. We teach them about attachment theory and transactional analysis and basic principles. We allow former addicts an intellectual framework for what they're doing. What emerges strongly from the research is that the 70s female punk generation experienced their subculture as a place of nurture. They discovered dissension as a creative practice and a life skill. Polly Hancock suggested to me that male punks remember the era differently, focusing on the cataloguing of dates, times, places, and B-sides. Whereas women are still searching for a new language to describe their experience. In their search for words to define processes that felt new, 70s punk women have become skilled in advocacy. Cohen defines advocacy as a process of identifying problems, then analysing the information gathered with courses of action. There is an increasingly complex environment for the public sector now in areas like health and education, so advocacy has become a precious commodity in a diverse society. Power resides in language and communication. And it's interesting that a large number of my female punk interviewees work in teaching or in the care system, speaking up for people struggling to articulate their reality. According to Liz Naylor, for me, punk is about authenticity and existential philosophy. We work with addicts who don't know who the hell they are and never have. Lots of people have been abused and subjected to trauma, so they disassociate. That question of authenticity is really present. You can only advocate on behalf of somebody if you're listening and you're being listened to. It's a dual process. Punk started that by thinking about the artist's relationship with the audience and reciprocity. Some UK historians like Dominic Sambrook and Andrew Marr represent punk as a youth culture that didn't trouble the establishment and had no lasting effect. Worley et al. Examined 1970s evidence and found no evidence of punk subverting elites. However, they acknowledged that if punk's effects were not felt at the time, today ex-punks may now occupy positions in political and administrative power. Many from the punk generations are now in such positions, bringing about social change. And this study contributes to that view that affecting political change is a lifetime's work. Dick Hebdige defined punk as a signifying practice, repeated performative acts of making. Because it was a foundational movement, there was an absence of role models, particularly for women, and that gap created room for DIY activity. We externalize the process of female self-making, and we consciously pass this information down. It's there in what we tell our daughters about body image and female solidarity and strength. Punk provided us with a valuable political framework because it was built with the input of many ideas. And it works in a similar way to feminism. It's something that's continually contested, but it withstands that conflict because punk, like feminism, is born out of paradox and conflict and ambiguity, and it allows for difference and multiple identities. And that's how punk and our punk identity becomes this enduring lifelong project. So for the final section of my seminar today, I'd just like to talk a bit about some of the later examples of punk feminism, and I'm drawing a little bit on role model theory. And I'm interested in how each generation takes inspiration from earlier iterations and how punk feminism can provide a sort of toolkit to deal with many issues around agency and sexuality and representation. I've quoted here from a couple of studies into role models. Psychologists Ivaldi and O'Neill have worked with focus groups with 381 adolescents. And in their study, Adolescents' Musical Role Models, Whom Do They Admire and Why? Their findings showed that for both genders, more male musicians than female were identified as role models. And a higher percentage of female participants valued looks as an important social currency. It's interesting, therefore, that punk girls often disrupt the visual image, and that's a central part of female punk work. And you see that not just in the 70s generation, but in every generation since then. The findings corroborate the argument that role models need to be visible to have cultural and social effect. And there, I picked out from Morgan, Roth and Ryan, who did a study in 2015 into the motivations behind role modeling, the motivational theory of role modeling. And they argue that role models have an energizing force that enables us to imagine positive possible selves. They also affect our understanding of goals and motivation. They say observing someone successful, engaging in a task, increases one's confidence in successfully completing the task itself. So it could be argued, and that they also talked about how if you don't have role models, self-stereotyping becomes entrenched. And they quoted to a study of a group of female solicitors whose perceptions of gender discrimination affected their motivation, with the impact of lower organizational commitment and higher incidence of quitting jobs. It could be argued then that female musicians have faced similar struggles in the absence of role models. So I was very struck recently, I read a fantastic interview with June Millington from the all-girl rock band Fanny, the 1970s girl band, who said recently, there was a lot of stuff that was against us. It was like a curtain, misogyny, misogyny, misogyny. I cannot overstate how that defeated us. Something as simple as going into a music store to get guitar strings. They couldn't believe you were getting electric strings. It was on every level. It was horrible to encounter that. So at the age of 24, I just had to quit. Decades later, though, there's a different kind of social modelling. It's not perfect, but women are now represented much more and in so many diverse ways. And we have a kind of positive social modelling and role models that have become a crucial part of women's self-efficacy, their sense of agency in the world. And we can trace this through the ley lines of punk feminism. So now you can see how young women are linked to this, and it helps them form a sense of motivation and performance and possible selves. So I just want to go through a few examples of these different generations and iterations of punk feminism. I talked earlier about the expansion generation of the 1990s, and here, an example here of Bikini Kill, who really spearheaded that riot girl movement. And we're drawing on references to 70s punk in what they did. In the 2000s, we had that kind of conserving era of quote unquote post-feminism. And on the left, you had kind of Spice Girls with their girl power concept. And on the right, the all-female band Warpaint. And around then, I remember a lot of the arguments were, we're now in a post-feminist era. There was the sense that that struggle is over, and now we're on to a new discussion, and being the only girl in the room is not the issue. Then we come to a sense of renewal in 2012 to 2017 with a sort of fourth wave punk feminism, and Pussy Riot were really at the centre of that, and they were drawing on punk and second wave feminism. And at that time, we were really aware of the reality of women's rights globally, not just Russia, women in Afghanistan who couldn't be educated, women in Saudi Arabia who were forbidden to drive, and the realization that one woman's oppression affects us all. Another part of this work in this era of renewal was the introduction of intersectionality and considering multiple perspectives of ethnicity, of gender, of class, etc. And on the right, you have there the band Skinny Girl Diet, who were drawing on the inspiration of the 90s and Riot Girl. And they're the kind of significant themes of that renewal generation: empowerment, using the internet, discussing feminism in terms of intersectionality, and a very important part of this, anti-rape culture and body shaming. Then we come to the transformation generation, and just a whole, now it's what's so great about the current generation is it's less about this kind of North American British axis in terms of popular music and punk. It's now has a more global feel. So there's global feminisms and talking here because I'm talking to you wonderful people in Barcelona. I'm thinking about some of your great Spanish all-girl bands. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. Lisa Simpson, a graphic and musical project that started in 2018 at the Fine Arts Campus in Valencia. And this reminds me very much of another great visual musical project, Chicks on Speed, which started in Berlin. And I love that sense of collaboration and artistic collaboration. And then on the right, we have Melena's garage pop from Pamplona in northeast Spain. And they've truly gone global. They're now released by the Chicago label Trouble in Mind. More bands kind of showing that it's not just, you know, for years punk feminism was associated, was very white in terms of representation, and now you have many more punks of colour. So on the left we've got Meet Me at the Altar, US pop punk band. They all met and formed via the internet. They all come from 3 different states and they joined forces through YouTube. Then on the right, you have Big Joni from London, Punks of Colour. They started up the Decolonise Festival for punks of colour. And their music is a brilliant blend of what they call Black feminist sister punk. Another aspect of this transformative generation is trans artists. So on the left, trans and non-binary artists, we have Dory and Electra, who create some brilliant kind of hyper pop and future pop. And on the right, one of my really most favorite artists is Arca, a trans Latin woman who does amazing kind of electronic industrial pop. She says, I see my gender identity as non-binary and I identify as a trans Latin woman. Just a few more examples of the current transformative generation. Billie Eilish, really showing new kind of role models, particularly for my daughter's generation. It was very liberating going to a gig with her a few years ago and seeing Billie Eilish and the mosh pit being completely full of young 14-year-old girls completely moshing it. And on the right, Willow Smith, drawing on pop punk and emo for her work and identifying as bisexual and polyamorous. And then lastly, Ugly Pop, Skating Polly, who, when I was originally going to do this talk, they were on at the Lexington, and I was going to see them. And what's great about Skating Polly, and if you get to see the film, please do, because it's such a good film, it's such a good documentary, and it nicely points out those ley lines of punk feminism, because Skating Polly are a young contemporary punk band who work with Exene Cervenka from 70s LA punk band X, and they also work with 90s riot girl group Babes in Toyland. And with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I've got references here for all those sources. And I will also, Angels has this PowerPoint, and I'm sure we'll be happy to put it into your archive.
Well, it's so valuable, Lucy, your research in punk feminism, all the literature, examples, ideas, like the role model theory and more, and we could continue with you another hour. It would be fabulous. Regarding Skating Polly, is the son of Exene Cervenka who's directing the movie.
Yes, that's right.
Henry Mortensen. Yes, that's correct.
Yes,
and I know that there's someone here. Ona, you had a question for Dr. Lucy O'Brien.
Yes, I really like the DIY component that you presented at the beginning. And I was just wondering, and maybe this is, I mean, I don't know if it's statistically significant, but at least in the United States, kind of there's been a resurgence for an interest in thrifting. And I was just wondering if you could connect punk women doing that in the past and kind of empowering women today to kind of craft their identity with a diversity of clothing, right? Because it's like when you go into like the big stores, it's kind of like styles have been pre-selected for you. So I wonder if it has carried on to today.
Oh, that's a really good question. It's tough, isn't it? When so much has been commodified and kind of and streetwear has been commodified and is in department stores. I think I see a lot of real inventiveness. Again, my daughter's 18 and she completely has her own style, but I'm very struck by the influences from punk coming through. But she does incredible things with makeup that we, this sort of Jordan-esque, very elaborate things she does with her eyes and her eye makeup. And that combination of really quite confrontational and blocky shapes with also femininity, lines of femininity, and mixing and matching. I think that element of collage and bricolage still goes on. And I'm amazed at the inventiveness of what younger women are doing in terms of their hair, their makeup, their dress. And it keeps coming back to those principles of DIY, and they're probably doing similar things in digging out vintage clothes and mixing and matching them with contemporary stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So, Lucy, you emphasize the importance of the subcultures and the fact that each cohort creates their own meaning. Are you optimistic on how new generations will continue being subcultures? Are they going to be having, a different perspective, like becoming more mainstream or having more access to the music industry and all the menaces they are there? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's different kinds of battles. There are battles, they're slightly different. I think the internet has given women a lot more creative space and independence, that's definitely for sure. But then there's that double-edged sword of, I've been speaking to some young female artists who are releasing their own tracks at the moment. And there's the TikTok effect. There's still this incredible pressure to look sexy and inviting. And they're caught in a double bind because they know that if they sell themselves a little on their sexuality, that they'll get more work with producers and they'll get more streams. So they're contending with the same sorts of issues. It's in a slightly different form, but they're still having to really contend with that.
So would be also the case that the making magazine editors and music industry executives more aware of the, all these derogatory practices for women.
Yeah, I always try and remain optimistic, and I am very struck with how record labels are writing workplace policies. Whether they enforce them or not, I don't know, but it shows that there's a new consciousness, and this is post Me Too. There's a much more of a consciousness about hypersexualization and the effects of hypersexualization, that they can be very toxic and lead to eating disorders and lead to mental health issues in female artists. And that dialogue and that discussion is now taking place in record companies and management companies, and it's present there in a way. This is something that's relatively recent. It's only been in the last few years, and I do think that that's kind of an evolution of punk feminism, if you like, that those sorts of ideas that started on the margins, we're now seeing are actually beginning to infuse the policy of major labels, that sort of awareness and that vocabulary and the language around representation and hypersexualization, etc.
Mm-hmm. So that would be the changes that would be desirable or feasible in the cultural industries to make this more inclusive, this record industry, like having more women in festivals, or it would be like having quotas, for example?
Yes, and that's a discussion. Some of you might be aware of Key Change, the organisation. It's now an EU organisation, which is aiming for 50-50 gender split at festivals by 2025. I think that was the initial campaign, and now it's really diversified, and it's working towards general equality within all areas of the music industry. And just the fact that these initiatives are here and there is a language around that means that that kind of change is starting to happen. It might be slow, but it is starting to happen.
Michelle, do you have a question, or Karma, or anyone else? No? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lucy, for your inspiring session, and thank you for your work, Dr. Lucy O'Brien. We're hoping to see you soon in Barcelona or anywhere in the world. Actually, these technologies allowed us to be everywhere.
Yeah.
So thank you again to all the participants and to all the people that have joined us week after week, and to ESMUC again for their support. Gracias a todas, a todas. Buena sorte. Hasta muy pronto. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely to meet you all.
Adios.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.